The village of Calemore had a rule that no one ever wrote down but everyone understood. Do not look the Duke in the eye. Do not speak to him unless spoken to. And if you happen to pass him on the road, lower your head and keep walking. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Calemore, had returned from the war 11 years ago without a word of welcome or a single celebration. He had simply appeared one gray morning at the gates of his estate, climbed out of a carriage, and disappeared inside. He had not hosted a dinner since. He had not attended a village gathering since. He walked his grounds alone before sunrise, spoke to no one, and dismissed 3 housekeepers in the space of a single month. The stories spread the way stories always do in small places, where life moves slowly. Some people said he had lost his mind in the fighting. Others said he had done something terrible and carried the guilt of it everywhere he went. A farmer who had once glimpsed him through the library window at midnight told anyone who would listen that the Duke had been standing completely still in the dark, staring at nothing, for nearly an hour. Children were told to stay away from the east wall of the estate. Mothers spoke his name in low voices. Old men shook their heads and said that war had a way of taking something from a man that could never be put back. No one thought to ask what, exactly, had been taken. Miriam Cole arrived in Calemore on a Tuesday morning in late October, stepping off the coach in a plain gray coat with a small travel bag over one shoulder and a letter of employment folded in her pocket. She was 28 years old, sharp-eyed, and not easily frightened. She had buried her husband 3 years earlier after a fever that had taken 11 slow days to do its worst, and since then, she had learned to move through life quietly and steadily, the way a person learns to walk again after a long illness. The position was a state librarian. The library at Ashford had not been properly tended in years, and the late Duke's solicitor had finally arranged for someone to come and put it in order. Miriam had answered the advertisement because she needed the work, and because she loved books with the kind of devotion that had never found a better place to go. The coachman warned her on the way up the hill. The innkeeper warned her when she stopped to ask for directions. A farmer leaning against a fence post near the estate entrance looked at her with something close to pity and told her to keep her head down and not ask questions. She thanked each of them sincerely and arrived at the front door with her chin level and her eyes open. The library was on the 2nd floor of the east wing, a long room lined floor to ceiling, with shelves that had not been touched in a decade. Books were stacked sideways on top of other books. Entire sections had been reorganized by someone, and then abandoned mid-task. There were letters piled on the reading table, some of them still sealed. There were water stains along one wall where a window had leaked and never been properly repaired. Miriam stood in the doorway for a moment and took it all in. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She was there 3 days before the Duke appeared. It was nearly midnight. She had been working late by lamplight, rearranging the natural history section into something that made sense, when she became aware that she was no longer alone. She turned, and he was standing in the doorway. He was taller than she had expected, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes the color of winter sky. He held a glass of brandy in one hand that he had clearly forgotten to drink. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was low and careful, as though he had not used it in some time, "You moved the natural history section." "I did," she said. "It makes more sense beside the geography volumes. I can put it back if you prefer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, slow and even, until they faded entirely. He came back the next night. He stood in the doorway for a shorter time, said nothing at all, and left. The night after that, he came in and sat in the chair by the window and watched her organize the manuscript section in silence. When she glanced up at him, he looked away. When she looked back at her work, she could feel his eyes return. It went on like this for a week. Small exchanges, observations about the condition of certain volumes, a question, once, about a water-damaged ledger she had found behind a stack of geography books. He answered her practical questions in short, precise sentences and asked nothing personal. But he kept coming back. It was Thomas, the head butler, who gave her the first piece of the real story. He was a man of about 60, quiet and dignified, who had been with the estate for 30 years. One afternoon he brought her a cup of tea while she was working, set it beside her without comment, and then stood for a moment looking at the shelves. He used to read to the tenant children on Sunday afternoons, Thomas said, very quietly, in this room, before he went away. He was a different man then. Miriam looked up at the tall shelves and the dusty lampshades and the stacked, forgotten books, and she felt something move in her chest. "What happened to him over there?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He came back, and the person who had been here before he left did not come back with him." He picked up her empty cup and walked out. Miriam sat for a long time after that, thinking. She began to pay closer attention. She noticed the way Edmund's hands sometimes gripped the arm of the chair when the wind shook the windows. She noticed that he never sat with his back to the door. She noticed the leather journal he carried with him everywhere, but never opened in front of anyone. She noticed the letters that came from the Veterans Hospital in London, and the way his face changed, just slightly, when he read them. One Tuesday a letter arrived that was thicker than the others. She was crossing the hall when he opened it, and she did not mean to look, but she saw his face. He read it standing completely still, and when he finished, he folded it slowly and closed his hand around it until his knuckles went pale. That evening, she came to the library and found him already there. He was sitting in her chair, in the dark, doing nothing at all. He had not lit the lamp, he had not opened a book, he was simply sitting. She did not ask what was wrong. She lit the lamp, took the other chair across from him, and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire. After a long silence, she said, "My husband died 3 years ago, a fever. It took 11 days. Near the end, I used to sit beside him without speaking, because everything I wanted to say felt too small. I learned in those 11 days that silence can be a very full thing. It does not always mean emptiness." She was not looking at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the fire. There was a long pause. "They think I am frightening," he said at last. His voice was flat, not angry, just tired. "I know," she said. "They are wrong." He did not respond to that, but he stayed until the fire burned low, and when he left, he said goodnight for the first time. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Miriam had expected when she had taken the position. The Duke began to talk. Not easily, not in long stretches, but in the careful, searching way of someone who has almost forgotten that words can be trusted. He told her about a man named Sergeant Davies, who had died beside him in the dirt outside a small town far from home, gripping Edmund's hand and asking him to write to his mother. Edmund had written to her. He had written every Christmas since, anonymously, saying only that her son had been a good man who had been loved by those who served with him. He had never stopped. He told her about the nightmares that had driven him to walk the corridors at night, because sleeping felt like being dragged back to places he could not survive a second time. He told her that he had dismissed the housekeepers not because of anything they had done, but because of the way they had looked at him, with wide, careful eyes full of pity, and that pity had felt like a wound on top of a wound. He told her that he had come home from the war and found that the person he had been before it left did not seem to exist anymore, and that he had spent 11 years in that house, unable to find him. Miriam listened to all of it. She did not offer comfort that was not true. She did not tell him that everything would be all right. She simply listened, steadily and without flinching, the way she had sat beside her husband at the end, because she understood that sometimes the greatest thing one person can offer another is the willingness to stay. In return, without planning to, she told him things she had kept tightly held since her husband's death, the loneliness that she had dressed up as independence, the way she had filled every hour with work, because stillness meant feeling, and feeling meant grief, and grief was something she had never quite let herself finish. The way she recognized in his silence the same language she had spoken to herself for 3 years. They were two people who had learned to live around their own pain rather than through it, and sitting in that library together, they began, very slowly, to find a way through. Lady Hargrove arrived on a Wednesday in November. She was Edmund's aunt, a sharp and well-dressed woman of 65 who had dedicated her life to the preservation of family reputation and who had been watching the situation at Ashford Estate with growing alarm. She swept into the front hall while Miriam was on her way to the library, and blocked her path with the particular confidence of someone who has never been told no. She informed Miriam that her presence was disruptive, that she was not the sort of person who should be spending private evenings in the company of the Duke. That whatever she imagined was happening, she was mistaken, and it would be better for everyone if she collected her things and returned to wherever she had come from. Miriam listened without interrupting. Then she said, quietly and clearly, "He has been alone with something terrible for 11 years. I am not taking anything from him. I am only sitting beside him while he finds his way back to himself." Lady Hargrove opened her mouth to respond. Edmund came down the stairs. He had heard everything. He stood at the bottom step and looked at his aunt with an expression she had not seen on his face in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. It was calm, it was certain, and beneath it, unmistakably, was something warm. He said, "She stays." Lady Hargrove looked between them for a long moment. Then she picked up her gloves from the table and walked out. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in the north of England, cautiously and a little cold, like something that is not yet sure it is welcome. But it came. The village began to notice small changes. The Duke had been seen walking the eastern field with the librarian in the late afternoon, both of them moving slowly, talking in the easy way of people who have learned each other well. He had attended the village school's reading morning and sat in the back row without speaking, but when he left, there was a crate of books from the estate library beside the door with a note that said only, "For the children." He wrote a letter to the Veterans Charitable Society in London, the first letter of that kind he had ever sent, and enclosed a donation large enough to fund their work for 2 years. He began, carefully and in small ways, to come back. He was not a new man. He was very much himself, still quiet, still careful, still carrying things that would never entirely leave him. But he had stopped disappearing inside the weight of those things. He had stopped walking alone through the dark corridors at 4 in the morning. He had stopped looking at the world from behind a wall of silence that no one was permitted to approach. One evening in April, when the library windows were open and the air smelled like rain and new grass, Miriam said to him, "You know, everyone out there thought there was something wrong with you." "I know," he said. "There was never anything wrong with you." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the light was leaving the sky. "I lost a great deal over there," he said. "Things I did not know how to speak about when I came home. And after long enough, silence becomes the only language you know." She looked at him. What changed? He looked back at her, and for the first time in 11 years, Edmund Ashford smiled. It was a small thing, a little uncertain, like a door opening onto a room that had been closed for a very long time. "Someone sat down across from me," he said, and was not afraid of the quiet. The village of Calemore went on telling stories, the way villages always do. But the story they told about the Duke changed. It became the story of a man who had carried a war home inside him and found no one willing to help him put it down. It became the story of a woman who had looked past everything frightening and seen something worth staying for. It became the story of two people who had both been hollowed out by loss and had found, quite unexpectedly, that the space left behind was large enough for something new. Edmund Ashford had been feared because he was silent. He had been silent because he was in pain. He had been in pain because he had loved deeply, a regiment of men, a promise made in the dirt, a version of himself that the war had taken, and he had never been given a safe place to grieve any of it. It took one woman, patient and steady and completely unafraid, to look at him without pity and without fear, to simply sit across from him and stay, until he remembered that the heart everyone had written off as cold or broken had been there all along. It had simply been waiting, very quietly, for someone to notice it was still beating.